Hey everybody, Joe Venorni, Cherry the Geek TV. We are back here at San Diego Comic-Con 2022, and we are talking with comic book writer Andrew Aydin, who people might know from working with Congressman John Lewis on his outstanding March trilogy, which in my estimation is one of the better books to come out in the past decade. It's a fantastic series. This is your first comic. You know, we've been away for 3 years. Congressman Lewis and you had attended all the Comic-Cons promoting March for, what is it, 4 years, 5 years?
We did 2013, 2015, 2016, and 2017.
So in this 3-year COVID gap, this is the first Comic-Con back, we sadly lost the Congressman. This is his first time back without him. Yeah. What's it like kind of being here without him?
I mean, it's hard. You know, you kind of walk around the convention center and you see the ghosts. You know, you're like, we did this in that spot. We had that signing there. That's where we led our march. That's where we, you know, did the things that people remember. And it's just like a sad moment because it makes it so much more poignant that your friend's not here.
He was always a very engaging presence here. The people loved him. He would lead a march after the panel with children. I got used to seeing him every year, and it's going to be kind of sad in a way, but I think in a way his spirit also lives on because we have a new book, and we'll talk about that in a second. Talk about the first time when you approached him for March. Was he familiar with the graphic novel concept? What was his reaction when this was pitched to him?
You know, after Congressman once, you know, I said, Congressman, you should write a comic book, and there's all the Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story history, and just trying to convince him and everything. But I remember at one point somebody asked him, like, what did you think when that young man said that? And he kind of leaned in and he said, I thought he lost his mind. And, you know, I think one of the things that was so great about John Lewis is that even if he didn't understand something at the time, he would learn. And he could see value. He could see ideas that were ahead of their time because he was so open to new ideas. He spent so much of his life advancing them that seeing the new ideas presented to him, even if they shocked him a little bit or didn't immediately seem apparent, you know, he was the kind of person who was so contemplative that he would think about it and he would really roll it around. And ultimately, I think many times he came to be, well, not just on the right side of history, but recognizing the way our society was moving before most people did.
So the book's written, you're out promoting it, you bring him to San Diego Comic-Con. For people that are into comic books and into pop culture, San Diego Comic-Con can be an overwhelming experience. What was his reaction when he shows up here and he sees the mass of people? Like, well, do you have any stories of like what his reactions were?
Yeah, well, definitely the first year when he came, you know, we were really nervous because no member of Congress had ever been to Comic-Con, and I mean, I was just from my perspective, you know, there was a lot riding on it because it's, you know, you're the staffer who's like, this is a good idea, and everybody else on staff is saying, this is a bad idea, and you're like, no, this can work. And so you get here, all these arrangements. I mean, there was like so much crazy stuff. Like they even gave away his hotel room the night he was getting in, you know? And so it's like everything, you're like, this is really hard to make happen. But then once he got here, even he was surprised at the warmth with which he was greeted. I remember one of the first things he said after a little bit walking around the show floor was, I need a costume. And he would call it, he would say it was a happening. That's the way he would describe it. And he really enjoyed it. And he would kind of bound around the floor and shake hands and see people. The first year was interesting, though, because a lot of people didn't recognize him yet, you know, because there's definitely a curve that happened where it was like at first, his story wasn't as widely known. I mean, the John Lewis we celebrate today, it was not the John Lewis who first showed up at Comic-Con in 2013. But I can remember him like just, there's Lou Ferrigno, and you're like, oh, Congressman, look, that's the Hulk. And he just runs over there and says, hello, and shakes his hand. And then over time, and other shows as well, like American Library Association and things around the country, he got to be he got to be treated like one of them. Mm-hmm. We all did. And I remember I introduced Stan Lee to him, and he got so excited, but then he kept telling his son, I met Stan Lee. You're like, no, it's Stan Lee, it's 2 words, and at Comic-Con, though, it held such a special place in his heart because he had that Eisner Award on his mantle until the day he died. He had one in Atlanta and one in D.C. And it was a special place for him. I mean, a place where we all had tremendous memories. I think he was most proud of the fact that at his first signing, everyone was so taken aback. The line got so long, the fire marshal had to shut it down. And, for me personally, that was a vindication, that this was an idea that worked. But also, I think for him, a validation of not just his contributions or his sacrifice, but that people recognize the importance of the work that he had done, not just for himself, but for what it meant for our society.
Talk about that year that he led the children, the march after the panel. How did that come about, and what was his reaction after that was over?
The Children's March happened because we had been working with students at San Diego Unified, and they were coming to the panel. And their teacher, a guy named Mick Rabin, asked me, he said, would it be possible for the students to get a few minutes with the congressman before you head down to the floor? And the schedule was really tight. And so I suggested, well, why don't we all march down to the floor together? And then they all lined up. We all lined up. The congressman was cosplaying that year too, right? He had his trench coat and his backpack on. and it was just this very organic moment where he's holding hands with these students, and we're all, Nate, myself, we're all marching together, and we didn't have an idea of people. We didn't think people would join in with this, but at a certain point, I remember we got to the stairs where we had to go down, and we looked back, and it was as far as the eye could see. People had jumped in and started marching with us, and it was completely unplanned or unfacilitated. They, as the Congressman would say, the spirit moved them to participate. Mm-hmm. And by the time we got down to the show floor and posed for photos with the students, I remember sitting down at the table. We were about to sign some books, and I checked my phone, and all of a sudden realized it was all over the internet. And, people share, and everybody else just being like, "Oh my gosh!"
It was one of those organic Comic-Con moments where you hear about these things that happen. It's usually Hall H related,
right,
with celebrities and movie stars and stuff. But the John Lewis March, that was an organic moment that wasn't planned, but it grew into something that was the most talked about. It was almost as talked about as whatever Marvel was doing in Hall H.
I mean, I think several reporters said to me after he passed, they were like, that was probably one of the most important marches that he led in the last several decades of his life. I mean, if not since the movement, because of what it represented to passing the baton to these younger generations. And it dramatized the conflict of what we were trying to do, right? John Lewis was quite literally trying to teach these young people how to march, how to stand up, how to speak up, how to speak out, how to use the tactics and the tools of the movement and the lessons of the movement to create that same momentum and that same sense of urgency for social change. And it's so clearly demonstrated exactly what we were trying to do that you look back on it and it almost seems self-evident that it would work its way into the zeitgeist like that.
So the March trilogy came out. It was very successful. Critics loved it. The people loved it. It wins the awards. You got the new book now, Run. What can you tell us about Run? Was Congressman Lewis involved with this? What was the idea when it was pitched to him? Like, what can we do next? How can we continue what we started here with the March book?
Yeah, well, you got to understand where we were at after March Book 3 happened. Like you said, we won more American Library Association awards than any book ever, the National Book Award, the Eisner, all of the things. But the story itself ended at what is such a publicly recognizable event, right? The signing of the Voting Rights Act. But when you learn the history, when you understand what John Lewis went through, you realize that what happened in the days and weeks and months after that is just as important, right? Like, when you're, if not more important, right? Because it's just weeks after that the Watts uprising happens. It's days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act that the Klan leads the largest hooded march in Georgia in decades, right? And for what we're going through, because remember, all of that happened in 2016 and in 2017. At the same time as the former president was being inaugurated. And explaining to people who were rightfully deeply fearful of what was happening in our country, what is happening in our country, they needed to understand and have a similar roadmap and a handbook to understanding that this happened to another generation. Right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, you have Julian Bond running for the Georgia General Assembly and them refusing to seat him because of his opposition to the Vietnam War, which is really a thinly veiled excuse to just simply not seat a young black man. And this hypocrisy, this pushback to great change becomes much more manageable. Right? It just as the participants of the movement felt like they were losing their country then. This shows the long arc of history and how perseverance and how standing up and facing this inevitable pushback is essential. And that those feelings of despair cannot be allowed to overwhelm you. Right? The congressman would always say, don't get down. Don't become lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. And this was our attempt to show how you pull yourself back up. That when you succeed on such a massive scale as they did with the signing of the Voting Rights Act, you have to be prepared and expect that the pendulum will swing again in the other direction. And how to handle that, how to work through it. And that's what Run tells the story of. And this first book, it's long, but it only focuses on a single year because so much happened. So much that's misunderstood, right? The origins of the Lowndes County Freedom Party and the establishment of what we think of as the Black Panther Party, but is quite separate from what actually was formed in Chicago and in California. And so this sort of history it just became essential for us to do it. So the congressman and I started working on it almost immediately after March Book 3 was released. And we worked on it for quite a long time because it's a much more difficult history to tell because it's not as well documented, right? I mean, Julian, who was the communications director for SNCC, he leaves to go to the General Assembly, and so there's no one keeping these records, right? And how important record keeping is. And we were so lucky that we had so many primary documents to use because we don't ad-lib anything, right? There's no quotes in there that are, loosely based on or historically fictionalized, right? They're all real quotes with documentation as sources. That's why there's 45 pages of endnotes in this book. And in some ways also we were trying to leave behind a document that will be a roadmap for future scholars when they're prepared to study this portion of the movement as well.
And so he was actively involved with the preparation of this book, that everything was completed before he passed?
Yeah, the hardest part while he was sick was how much joy he got from seeing the pages as they came in, right? And I would, this is the pandemic is just really starting to get going, and I'm like slipping the pages under his door, and he's leaving notes behind the planter for me, and we're talking on the phone, and because we were neighbors. And we got nearly everything done before he passed, but it was just really hard to be doing that while he was transitioning like that.
So Nate Powell was the artist primarily that worked on March. He's also involved with the new book run, and you have a new artist that's joined him, El Fury.
Yeah, Fury. Fury's fantastic.
Yeah, what can you talk about them and their contributions with the artwork?
Yeah, no, I think Fury's a real up-and-coming artist. This was her first full-length graphic memoir or graphic text. She worked incredibly hard. She was the Congressman's personal choice for this. We interviewed countless artists and had samples, and he loved the way she depicted him. And I can't imagine what a weight it was for her to carry doing this art at that time, being that lifeline to him for that little bit of hope and joy, and at the same time not getting to be with him. And she really just did a fantastic job. I think we're going to see really bright things from her. I love her as a human being and as a person. And, Nate and I have welcomed her into the team and the family. And matter of fact, she should be getting in here in just a few minutes. I've got her badge in my bag. And, she's just a real special person.
So you will be doing a panel tomorrow at Comic-Con about the book. Nate and Fury will be with you on the panel, as well as Congressman Lewis's son.
Yeah, John Miles is going to be with us. John Miles and I have been friends since I was in high school. I actually knew him before I ever worked for the Congressman, because we're all from Atlanta, and it's just really exciting to have him be here, because John Miles was actually such a part of this from the very beginning. It was John Miles who drove the Congressman to Dragon Con in 2009, when I was just starting to really get him engaged with the idea of comics. And we would sit down and have lunch, and we've spent a lot of time together, particularly since the Congressman's passed. And it's just been really wonderful to be able to stay connected and to be in each other's lives. And because there's only so many of us who really knew John Lewis like that, and I don't know of anybody who knew him better than we did. And to have someone to share those stories and those memories with means the world. It helps you deal with this unbelievable loss.
Well, it's bittersweet because this is the first Comic-Con back without Congressman Lewis, but I think while it's okay to be sad and to miss him, I think it's also time to celebrate, because he did a lot of great things, and he was a part of He's a part of Comic-Con. He's now part of the Comic-Con's history and legacy, and it's great that we honor him. And just like every year, there's tribute panels to Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I think you could come back every year and do a Congressman John Lewis panel, and people would show up for it. And he's loved, and he should be celebrated.
I think that's just a reflection of how much love Comic-Con and its fans had for him. I think you're right. John Lewis will always be a part of the history, the mythos of Comic-Con. I think this panel we're going to have tomorrow, you're right. It's not just a remembrance. It's not just a tribute. It's a celebration. But it's also, I think, for a lot of us, a reaffirmation to our commitment to continue his work, to keep pushing, to keep pulling. As the Congressman would say, to keep picking him up and laying him down. I think that's why it's so important that we continue the tradition of having a children's march, because we have to keep that John Lewis's memory alive. We can't let him simply become a statue or a painting on the wall or a slogan or a catchphrase. He was so much more than that, and we have to tell the story of the human being, the man who had fun here, who deeply enjoyed this experience, and who carved out a place for himself that most people didn't think was possible, and yet did so much good with it. And so we keep the books alive, we keep the memory alive, we keep the work alive by doing this.
Well, the book is called Run. You can get it from anywhere you buy your books, and also check out the March trilogy, also available wherever you buy your books. This is Andrew Aydin, and stay tuned for more coverage. San Diego Comic-Con 2022.